wide hips, a slim waist, and huge breasts. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the atypical female fantasy character. But you might be surprised to know that this isn't one of my creations. This is in fact my wife's character. Hello Internet, this is Adam A. Smith, back at my art desk once again, continuing to get work done. You might be glad to know, might be less glad to know that I come to you today with a moral quandary, a social dilemma, more of a discovery of a little social quirk that I wanted to share with you. Of course, let's begin with stating the obvious. Pop culture media, in general, has not always been, well, the kindest, necessarily, in its portrayal of women. It's been a huge part of the, feminism movement of the last decade or so. How media portrays women as a certain physical type and a certain mental type, let us say. Fulfilling certain character archetypes and not necessarily going outside of that. Of course, there's arguments to be made that that's true for males too, and that pop culture media in general is just relatively shallow, but that's beyond the point, really. The worst offender, of course, of these tropes is, well, comic books, let's be honest. But, very close second to that has traditionally been Dungeons and Dragons. Of course, it is a game system that came out in the 60s and has had a very traditionally male-dominant player base. So, it's not necessarily surprising that, though is disappointing. And it's something that I and most of the other players I try to play with tend to want to avoid most of the time. You don't always want just the adventure of, save the helpless maiden and whatnot. And, of course, in my art, it being sort of a fantasy theme, but in an anime-esque style of art, anime, the other pop culture icon known for its particular portrayal of women, really in the sandpit here, I suppose. Either way, I try to avoid it personally as well. I try to draw women that are strong, with varying body types, varying personalities, and all that and whatnot. Which is why I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, this Audlin Torengart, who is in fact also this character, Audlin Torengart, is the bustiest character I have ever drawn. Period, the end. And likely will be the bustiest character I ever do draw. And that was on specific request of my wife. Audlin Torengart was in fact the first character she ever made for a campaign with me. The first campaign we ever did together, Audlin was the character she made. And she's a half-dwarf, half-elf warrior woman of great strength and other attributes as well that were specified by my wife. And every single depiction I draw of Audlin, the conversation goes the same way. Oh, here, how about this picture I draw? And she's like, that's great. And could you make the chest area a bit bigger, please? I'm like, oh, okay. I'll have to inch it up bit by bit until she's happy. He's like, could you make the waist a little slimmer, and can you make the hips a little wider, and make her muscly still, of course, but I want her huge chest, slim waist, and wide hips. That female trope, and it came at request of my wife. And every other trope I've ever drawn, which happens to be none of the rest of these three, but every other time I end up drawing a female trope like that, scantily clad, with blossoming bosoms, as it were, it's always at request of a female friend. You might be surprised to hear that most of the big-chested and bodacious babes of Dungeons and Dragons these days are characters made by women, by females. Female players who want that kind of thing. And sort of as proof of the point, I recently just got my first commission. on my site. It's actually a friend of my mother, which is where the connection came from. Yes, I'm still early enough that most of my support comes from parents and family. So sue me. But one of my mother's coworkers is a big Dungeons and Dragons and live-action role-playing fan, and she wanted a picture drawn of her. I'm not showing that picture here because, well, that's a commission I'm still working on, and you'll have to wait for that. She gets to see it first. But, I was talking through the details with my mother. Be like, okay, what does she want? Oh, she wants this and that and blah, blah. And it got to the point where it's like, she was kind of almost embarrassed to ask, said my mother, but she wanted the character to have, large breasts and, wide hips and the thin waist and all that and the whole thing. I'm like, I get you. I've heard this story before. I know exactly where this is going. Anyway. And it was a female. It's a female friend of my mother who wanted those things. And it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, when guys, men, sit down to write, fantasy characters, and if you think about any comic book character hero ever, I'm looking at you, Chris Evans and Chris Hemsworth and all the other Chris's, it's always, a fit, muscular, handsome dude. It's not, oh, I made this D&D character and he's a total sleazebag and he's greasy and ugly and he's got warts and he's really scrawny and not really well fit. No, it's always, oh, I've made this character and he's a warrior and he's really cut and, grizzled and handsome underneath all that. No, rough and tumble, all that. It's the same kind of thing. Most often than not, it's like, oh, female friend of mine would be like, oh, I made a Dungeons and Dragons character and she's beautiful and witty and talented and deadly, but also gorgeous to look at, and the death of men, as it were. 9 times out of 10, that's the case. They want characters that are beautiful, the same that men want to make characters that are beautiful. Think of that however you will. And also make whatever conclusions of that you might want. Of course, whenever we create anything that portrays females, or anyone, in fact, we should always keep in mind, a certain amount of equality. Check our own personal biases and all of that good stuff. However, it's important enough to remember that, I don't know, actually. These are confusing topics, of course. Otherwise, this would be stuff that no one would be talking about, of course. I just find it interesting that, this great old trope of, oh, of course the chick in this fantasy thing has huge tits and a tiny waist and all that. 9 times out of 10, the female characters I draw like that are drawn like that because a woman requested me draw it like that. I don't know. Make of this conclusion what you will. It was simply something I felt I should put out there. And judge me as you will. From, my various women in this particular picture here. Thank you for listening to my little social gripe, and I'll see you in the next video.